We're going to be hearing from Dr. Mia Bloom, Dr. Jeffrey Abdicott, and Representative Burke Day. It's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Mia Melissa Bloom. She's the author of Dying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terror, New York, Columbia Press, 2005 and 2007, and a new edited volume entitled Living Together After Ethnic Killing with Roy Licklider, London, Routledge, 2006, regarding post-Civil War reconciliation. She is currently completing a new book, manuscript on rape and war, and articles on the radicalization of Muslims in Europe and the 1990 proxy bombing campaign in Northern Ireland, co-authored with Dr. John Horgan. Her research on female terrorists appears in the June-July issue of the Department of State, Countering the Terrorist Mentality, and she is an assistant professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at the University of Georgia in Athens. She has held research or teaching appointments at Princeton, Cornell, Harvard, and McGill universities. Without any further ado.
Thank you very much for being brave enough to continue through the rest of the day. I think I have to have this lowered. And I want to thank ICT and Boaz in particular for bringing me here, as well as Shani for all of her coordination. So I didn't want to forget to thank Shani for all her hard work. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is how suicide bombing appears to be making a metamorphosis or a transformation into a largely sectarian tactic between Sunnis and Shia. And in particular, I want to address issues of recruitment strategies in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Basically, for those of you who are not familiar with my work, I deduced, looking at a number of other cases outside of Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, that suicide bombing seemed to generate certain general hypotheses. One was that it very often occurred in the second stage of a conflict. In other words, not the first Intifada, but the second, not the first part of the Chechen war, but the second, and so on and so forth. That it tended to be a rational strategy. But very often, although I've written a book on suicide terrorism, I wanted to emphasize that I don't want to fetishize suicide terrorism to the extent that I acknowledge and recognize that it's always used in conjunction with a variety of other tactics that are not suicidal. But if I was to say that I had a contribution to this literature, it was to focus in on the domestic side of the phenomenon and look at the way in which different organizations, terrorist groups, used suicide terrorism as a litmus test and competed with one another. And so that there was a possibility that using suicide terrorism was a form of outbidding. One group would use terrorism as a way of upping the ante, and then the other groups would follow suit. So that suicide terrorism was occurring under two conditions: when other terrorist tactics would fail, but also when there was this competition. And then also what was very important to me, and I'm glad that Dr. Davis mentioned the proxy bomb campaign in Northern Ireland, that if suicide bombing was rejected by the larger community that the terrorists purported to represent, the terrorist organizations, being quite pragmatic, would alter their tactics. And so I've recently completed a study with Dr. John Horgan, previously of the University of St. Andrews and the incoming director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State, in which we tracked how Irish Republicans, ordinarily big supporters of the IRA, looked at this tactic of using coerced individuals to ram vehicles laden with explosives into British checkpoints, and they withdrew from the tactic. They started to pull back from it. And I'm going to talk about this use of proxies also in places like Afghanistan and Iraq when I get to it. For me, suicide terrorism is a tactic that is constantly evolving. We've had instances of truck bombs. We've had instances where women have been the perpetrator. And in fact, I wanted to add something that Reuven said to you earlier. In Fatah al-Islam, one of the unknown issues was that we have two women riding together on a motorcycle, very much like an Al-Qaeda attack, where one woman is driving and the other woman is faced the other way with a rocket launcher on her shoulder. And so even in groups that are Islamicists and Salafists, like Fatah al-Islam, we are seeing an increasing role for women, aside from the secular groups of which, Anat Berko is in the audience, I assume, and so you're familiar with the work that she's done. As well as, and there is going to be a workshop on the growing use of the internet. So I wanted to just sort of introduce the fact that the tactic itself changes regularly and evolves. Again, we're familiar with the fact that suicide terrorism is on the rise. Why I wanted to emphasize is that a lot of the statistical data sets that are out there, in particular my colleague Robert Pape, he focuses in on the data set and ends it in 2003. And so a lot of the hypotheses are problematic because if you look from 2003 to 2005, you see that there's been a humongous increase. And in fact, Diego Gambetta says that it's possible that as much as 487 attacks have occurred in 2005, which means that between 2003 and 2006, we've had more than 50% of all the suicide attacks that have taken place ever as a result of the Iraq War. If you were to look at a geographic dispersion of suicide attacks, we do see that it's definitely been globalized. It's gone from being in the 1980s and, Kuwait, Sri Lanka, I was going to say Sri Lanka, Kuwait, and now it's all over, from Israel, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, etc. The point that I wanted to make that corroborates something that that we've been speaking about all day is that the majority of the places in which we can observe suicide terrorism are in fact Islamic. But it's not to say that there's something particular about Islam versus other religions. And in fact, what I tried to do in the book was detail how every religion has, at some point in time, used the connection between death, sacrifice, terrorism, but that what's happened within Islam is that there have been strains of justification, both within Islamic scholarship as well as drawing from Quranic surahs from the two traditions. So that if you were to look at the political ideology of suicide terrorism, you have both this idea of tajdeed, martyrdom as a way of reviving the Islamic world back to the Khalifa or the Rashidun era, which includes both an offensive and a defensive form of jihadism. This is most active during times of perceived corruption or foreign invasion, and the examples would be Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. But we also have a form of political ideology with suicide terrorism as a form of millenarianism, so that martyrdom is a way of paving the way for the Mahdi. And again, this is more of a defensive jihadism and more active during times of perceived oppression. The examples, of course, being Lebanon and Iran. But what's interesting for me is that it appears that tajdeed is more correlated with Sunni Islam and that millenarianism is more correlated with Shiism. But again, if some of the trends that Reuven has noticed in Gaza appear to be true, then we're going to see a blurring of those lines. Some of the theoretical assumptions about suicide terrorism that exist in the literature either say that it's about foreign occupation, or it's been used to spoil a peace process, or the work that I've done on outbidding talks about multiple audiences and that suicide terrorism is a mechanism to win hearts and minds, as well as the fact that it will target domestic rivals. And I think what happens in places like Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, a lot of these existing assumptions are really bent in on itself, because a lot of the understandings that we have, Pakistan has no occupation. And in fact, as we've seen an increasing number of suicide attacks in places like Bangladesh and Somalia, again, the idea of occupation might be necessary, though insufficient. So let me talk for a second about problems of occupation. Part of it has to do with the propaganda that is emanating from within the Arab world. So for instance, very often they'll have the occupation of Iraq with images of the occupation of Palestine side by side in order to convey the idea that it's the same thing. And in fact, media outsources like Al-Manar, to a lesser extent Al Jazeera, try to emphasize the connectivity between the two kinds of occupations. When in fact, if you were to look at Iraq, you would see that it's quite a varied demographic between Sunni Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Sunni Kurd, mixed areas, and so on and so forth. But that the appeal of suicide terrorism in Iraq stems from four different approaches, and this draws from the work of Mohammed Hafez in his book Suicide Bombers in Iraq. Both are having tactical advantages, the kill ratio, the fact that the human bombs are smart bombs, that it's cost effective, it's quite cheap, but it creates quite a havoc and high casualty rates. that it also garners a great deal of media attention, as well as the fact that there's a strategic communication at work. It communicates the fact that people are willing to die for the cause, a level of determination, as well as the fact that for every individual lost, according to Nasser Hassan, every martyr generates an additional 12 new recruits for an organization. So again, I don't think that that's unique to Palestine. I think that among the Palestinians, using suicide terrorism was also a litmus test of which organization was the most active and the most willing to confront the Israelis. It also tends to demoralize the enemy, to frighten and polarize the other side, as well as a reflection of different kinds of organizational legitimacy, factional distinctions, and the opportunity to induce repression on internal individuals or organizations that might generate a certain amount of dissent. There appear to be three main insurgent groups in Iraq, but again, I'm going to show you that there's a lot more than three main ones. There's the Sunni Salafi militants, both foreign and native Sunni Arabs, and some Sunni Kurds. There's the Ba'athist and non-Ba'athist nationals. These are mostly Sunni Arab native Iraqis. And then there are Shia groups that are related to Muqtada Sadr, as well as some of the other Sadrist groups. If you were to look, and this is an image that was generously loaned to me by Evan Coleman, if you were to look at the major Sunni militant groups, and this is in March of last year, you see that there is not just one Sunni group, but a variety of Sunni groups. And as a result of some of the hypotheses that I generated in the book, the argument I made was the more groups you're going to have, the more likely the groups would begin to compete, and there was a likelihood of outbidding, where violence would be used and they would up the ante one against the next. There's a long discussion, again, and I want to draw heavily from Reuven's existing work, about the fact that the majority of the suicide bombers, and I don't mean insurgents, I don't mean people who plant roadside bombs or people who engage in non-suicidal activity, but there has been discussion that the majority of the suicide terrorists in Iraq tend to be foreigners. And in fact, 94 have been Saudi, there have been 7 from Kuwait, another 7 from Iraq, 6 from Syria, 3 from Libya, 8 from North Africa, 3 from Jordan, 2 from France, and 2 from Belgium. But when you look at the largest contingent, you're basically looking at Saudis. And if you break it down, you can see that 61 are from the Najd, 12 from Qasim and Bourdia, 7 from Mecca and the Hejaz, 5 from the south and 2 from the north. So again, the Saudi contingent tends to be very predominant. And the Saudis very often are self-funded. And so a lot of the discussion that we've had about a financial incentive, you know, the big check that used to come from Saddam, this is not necessarily any kind of incentive. And in fact, in many of the interviews conducted, either by myself or by others, of failed suicide bombers, as I like to joke, the successful ones are extremely difficult to interview, very few ever mention the money or the 72 virgins. But they talk about different things as forms of motivation, which I can talk about more in the Q&A. I want to focus more on recruitment and tactical issues. What's interesting for me is that there is also an inverse correlation, if you will, with the amount of money we pour into Iraq and necessarily the increased popularity of suicide bombings and the increasing existence of suicide attacks. And so that there's something more at work than focus of the United States, presence of the United States, the number of troops, and so on. Now, this idea that the multiplicity of groups is an inherently dangerous situation was echoed by the ICG report that came out in February of 2006. And again, for clarity, Crisis Group distinguished 3 phases in the evolution of the insurgents' discourse. In reality, rather than being clearly separate and sequential, they were overlapping and intertwined. Competition between the groups for greater visibility generated increasingly bloody and controversial deeds. And I want us to remember that because this idea of a divide and rule strategy, either among Israelis or among the Russians or even among the Americans in Iraq, has always seemed to be like a good idea. But I think what happens is in the long term, it might actually be generating a multi-headed hydra rather than a divide and conquer strategy that weakens the enemy. When you look at the kinds of attacks, we are looking overwhelmingly in Iraq at car bombs. 70% are car bombs, a few truck bombs, and there's been a few 25% explosive belts. So that basically the variety is quite interesting. But for me, what is particularly compelling is if you look at the distribution of targets, you see that 44% are Iraqi security and police, 23% civilians, and only 15% are coalition forces. And again, what I find interesting, and especially in this audience, is that it's really the coalition forces that we hear most about. And I think part of that is a reflection of U.S. national interest, but also we need to understand that the variety of suicide attacks in Iraq is a reflection of a lot of things that are going on domestically within Iraqi politics. One of the issues that is particularly salient is the rise of Muqtada Sadr, and as well as the fact that I'm going to slightly disagree with some of the previous panelists to say that Al-Qaeda in Iraq is not a unified entity, but in fact, shockingly enough, neither is Shia insurgency, and in fact, we're increasingly hearing about Shia on Shia violence. And a lot of this has to do with which strongman the Shia tends to align with. And it's something to emphasize because I think that we're seeing that the civil war at the micro level is far more complicated than even we've imagined so far. Now, this is again wanted to, and I hope you can see the red dots. This is from U.S. military source. And it's a little bit old. It's a map of Sadr city and the Assadrist enemy activity in terms of insurgency. And what you see in the first corner cell is you see enemy activity. On the right, you see all the different Assadr cells, Mustafa Sadr, Hussein al-Maliki, Mu'amal al-Sadr, Kaiser al-Shawali, so on and so forth. On the bottom left, you see the power distribution, again correlated with the red dots. On the one hand, the red side is showing where power is fairly inconsistent. And on the bottom part, on the yellow side, power is consistent 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. In other words, people can plan their day when there's going to be power. But for me, what was most compelling was if you looked at where there was raw sewage running through the streets in Sadr city, I found it shockingly compelling that it correlates exactly with enemy activity of the insurgency. And so it's, again, something to think about, some of the infrastructural issues that can be addressed, that still need to be addressed, as far as undermining motivations for the groups and joining the groups. The other issue has been, based on Mohafiz's work on Iraq, to also look at the correlation between counterinsurgency operations and spiking use of suicide bombing. And I'm going to have to scroll through this because I am running out of time. When we look at suicide terrorism in Iraq, we can't but ignore the fact that it has spread increasingly to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And again, in both of those cases, we see a variety of attacks, both against coalition forces as well as civilians and government recruits. In Pakistan, there have been over 40 attacks to date, some against domestic targets, and some, what's interesting for me is that the groups appear, they create ghost groups, sometimes they then disappear, only to reappear later on. And as a result of the ghost groups, it becomes increasingly difficult for the government to clamp down, because as soon as the government decides that they're going to clamp down on a particular organization, they rename themselves and reappear. The main focus, however, has been sectarian enemies. The secondary focus has been, either foreigners like David Foy, the consular staff member who was killed the day before President Bush visited Pakistan, and also attacks against Pakistani government officials, like up to 6 attacks against Musharraf and several attacks against the Interior Minister, Sherpal. What's interesting is from interviews conducted in Pakistan, there is no standard profile of the Pakistani suicide bombers. The recruitment tends to be relatively easy since most are volunteers. The majority were male from lower to middle class, 18 to 20s, which again does fall under the category of what we expect. But what is particularly interesting is that they tend to appear in classes, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. There's a cohort class that enters training, between 50 to 100 individuals that are trained. The cohort group is trained for approximately 3 weeks. From the 3 weeks of training, 8 are chosen. These 8 are then given an additional 3 months of training. From the 8, 2 are chosen of the 8 for additional, more specific, long-term, intense, advanced specialization. At the end of which, there's hundreds of Pakistanis, and they will be released in groups of 2 to 5 at a time. And so what's particularly interesting is that they have standardized bomber recruitment to such an extent that they have an almost assembly-like opportunity to release bombers at will. So it means for me that although there have been 40 Pakistani bombers to date, I expect in the future there will be several more. The bomber recruitment, again, very interesting for me, and especially given the Vice President's statements over the last few years, is that fewer than 50% were trained in madrasas. 35 attended less than 6 months, and so on and so forth. You have the statistics in front of you. And again, only 44 were illiterate, and in a Haripur sample, only 23 were illiterate. In other words, we're dealing with a population that's disproportionately more educated than the larger Pakistani population, which correlates precisely to some of the Kruger-Malakova findings in their NBER paper about the correlation between education, poverty, and terrorism. And again, there's no active recruitment. Most were volunteers. I mentioned the specific standard operating procedure for recruitment, and here's something that is also very interesting. According to the interviews, there's an alleged geographic sensitivity. In other words, the organizations will not send more than 2 people from the same village at any one time, in part because they're worried about a government counter-operation in that village, so that there's this geographic sensitivity. So again, they're operating on a fairly sophisticated level. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm somewhat out of time. The motivations vary. Basically, there's a mixture of reasons and rationales. All in the sample said jihad was important, but only 33% claimed to be religious. What was particularly salient for me is that many repeated this very sectarian phrase, kill a Shia, go to paradise. But fewer than 20% ever mentioned the virgins. The sectarian divisions in Pakistan of 30 years ago, over the course of time, because of the use of violence, have decreased in such an extent that it has caused a division of the different ethnic groups. And so violence in Pakistan have helped to separate the different ethnic communities that might have been physically and demographically intermixed. The attacks against mosques and Shia processions have been particularly virulent, generating anywhere from 23 to 53 deaths, not wounded, but actual deaths. And in fact, some of the attacks have been, so unbelievable that they've literally ripped the pillars off or they've cracked the dome of the mosque. So high amounts of explosive, very often with teams of 2 and 3 and 4 people as coordinated attacks. Again, very sophisticated. Why is it important? Well, what happens in Pakistan and Afghanistan has a spillover effect in Europe. And in fact, if you look at some of the more radical clerics in Europe, and luckily no one's in the room, but again, you see a reflection of what we were saying in the earlier panel, that Europe is potentially in danger of experiencing a sustained campaign of suicide terrorism with this spillover effect. I just want to spend an additional, if I can take 2 more minutes, with permission. In Afghanistan, again, we don't hear much about this, but there have been 246 attacks. If you were to look at it based on the annual average, you see that the numbers definitely are increasing. And in fact, in 2000 up until now, we've already had 96. But the interesting finding that Prakash Sharma has found is that 43% of the attacks in 2006 and 47% this year have been failed attacks where the bomber has only managed to kill himself. And so the attacks have been varied, but again, we see the same kind of sectarian reflection in Afghanistan as we did in Pakistan, where the majority of the attacks that are successful are soft targets and Shia civilians. And like what happened in Pakistan in the 1970s, when the Ahmadiyyas were declared to be non-Muslim, there's been a movement in Pakistan and in Afghanistan to do the same thing about Shia, to make the group Shia to be potential that you're allowed to kill them during the course of the jihad. I've mentioned this. The strategy is for political destabilization. It's been also used as a form of targeted assassination. There have been several attempts against Karzai. But it plays out, again, as part of the sectarian internecine conflict. I want to mention for a second both the use of proxy bombs in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Similar to what we saw, what I mentioned earlier about Ireland, according to military sources in Iraq, there have been a number of preempted suicide attackers in truck bombs or car bombs that were actually physically handcuffed to the wheel, as well as the fact that other preempted bombers driving trucks knew that they were driving contraband, but didn't realize they had volunteered for a suicide mission, and the trucks were being detonated at a distance. Now, either this might be a reflection of the enemy's weakness and inability to recruit. And according to one military source, that was what was going on. But again, according to an American general in Afghanistan, who I'm not allowed to tell you who it is, said that actually the attackers want to use a wide variety of tactics in order to destabilize both the American and the British presence, as well as to convey the message that they can attack anywhere, anytime. My future research project is, again, to sort of focus in on these VBIEDs. And again, the research project is a collaboration between, as usual, Dr. John Horgan, Dr. Max Taylor, Ken Peace, and myself. What the project does is it proposes practical applications for counterterrorism to enhance the capacity of experienced and inexperienced personnel to identify and be alert to probable targeting. And I'll give you an example. Based on the studies we've done of car bombs in Ireland, you can, at a distance, look at a car chassis, and if the back of the chassis is riding very, very low, you know something very heavy is in the trunk. That is one of your first visual cues. And so what we're doing right now is we're creating, sort of in virtual reality, training mechanisms. At that point, I have now exhausted the patience, so thank you very much for your time.